Brene Brown once wrote, owning our story and loving ourselves through that process is the bravest thing we will ever do. My name is Brad, and welcome to the Daily Bread. You are enough. I want you to say that to yourself, that I am enough. Go ahead, take some time and say that to yourself a few times. A lot of times we forget that we are enough. And I always say that we don't have to be proud of our story, but we do have to own our story because it is ours. And sometimes we have to do the messy work, right, of working through some very difficult stuff in order to come out better on the other side. I want to read you another quote from Brene Brown. She says this. She says, owning our story, there's that owning part, right? We have to own it, can be hard, but not nearly as difficult as spending our lives running from it. A lot of times we spend our times running from our past instead of facing it head on. Again, we don't have to be proud of it, but we have to own it, right? And she goes on to say, embracing our vulnerabilities is risky, but not nearly as dangerous as giving up on love and belonging and joy, the experiences that make us the most vulnerable. And here's the quote that I absolutely love. Only when we are brave enough to explore the darkness will we discover the infinite power of our light. Sometimes we have to go through the darkest moments, right, in order to get to the light. One of my favorite quotes from the Batman series, The Dark Knight, was in one of the movies where I can't remember who said it, but I believe maybe it was Batman himself who said, it is always the darkest part of the night just before the sun rises. And I love that. Sometimes we have to go through that darkest moment in order to get to the light. But I'm here to remind you all today that regardless of what your past is, regardless of where you have come from, that you are right where you belong, that you are enough, that God loves you despite your imperfections, because God created you and God makes no mistakes. One of my favorite passages in the Bible comes from the writing of the Apostle Paul, who in his second letter to the Corinthians write, and God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Wow. Power is perfected in weakness. In other words, God says that I can use your weaknesses and make those weaknesses as a conduit to show my power. I just came off of a series at my church where I talked about that weakness and how God can use it as a conduit for God's power. When he chooses Gideon to save the Israelites from the Midianites. And the story of Gideon in the Old Testament, God uses the weakest person of Gideon's family, Gideon, whose family was the weakest family in their tribe, whose tribe was the weakest of all the tribes. And yet Gideon was enough. And God used that weakness, God used that unfaithfulness that Gideon had at first as a conduit for God's power. And why does God do that? The Apostle Paul goes on to say, most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am well content with my weaknesses, with my difficulties, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. And as God uses our weaknesses as a conduit for God's power, we cannot take credit for that. We have to give credit to that higher power, don't we? And so today I want you to remember that despite everything, despite the darkest moment you may be going through, light is about to come. And that in your weakness, you have power and you are enough. Well, that's all for today. Take care, everyone. I will see you again tomorrow.